Actor Richard Chamberlain has passed away at the age of 90, just one day shy of his 91st birthday.
He vanished as quietly as he had once dazzled. No final interview, no Hollywood tribute, just the sea, the silence, and a press release. Richard Chamberlain, once the face of primetime desire, exited this world not with fanfare, but with riddles. And what followed wasn't closure. It was a haunting stillness filled with missing signatures, unsent letters, and names no one recognized. Behind the elegance of his coastal retreat and the prestige of a 60-year career lies a story too complex for headlines, too intimate for eulogies. Who was the man the cameras never truly captured? And what secret thread connects a decades-old estate sale to something quietly left behind? This isn't just the end of a legend, it's the beginning of a mystery, a departure wrapped in silence. Richard Chamberlain's passing on March 29, 2025, marked the end of a legacy, but not the beginning of clarity. At 90, the celebrated actor known for roles in Dr. Kildare and The Thorn Birds died of complications from a stroke in Waimanalo, Hawaii, a place far removed from the studios that once defined him. There was no fanfare, no dramatic final curtain call, only a brief confirmation by his longtime publicist, Harlan Bowl. The silence that followed wasn't serene. It was filled with questions no obituary could answer. Though his net worth was estimated at $25 million, the future of Chamberlain's estate remains unclear. With no publicly known children and a divorce that left him without a legal spouse at the time of death, his assets now sit in a liminal space. Who inherits the fortune of a man whose life was both highly visible and deeply guarded? Legal experts have only just begun to navigate what could be a labyrinth of accounts, properties, and potentially undisclosed trusts. It could be assumed that the silence about his wealth was purposely done. Chamberlain lived so much of his life concealing parts of himself from the public eye, especially his sexuality, relations, and even health. His protective instincts for keeping away the tabloids might frustrate lawyers and associates trying to put together his financial legacy. If his last will and testament existed, it was probably covered with countless legal ambiguities or slid within private letters never intended to be seen publicly. What remains beyond doubt is that Chamberlain's death cannot be considered closure. Rather, it became an unraveling of threads. To the grace of his home in Hawaii and the glamour of his career, there stood a man skilled in the art of mystery. In the days following his death, he was remembered by the world as an icon. But those closer to him were left with something else, an uncanny disquiet, the burden of unfinished business, and the feeling that Chamberlain remained just beyond their reach, even in his death. But before the world could make sense of his silence, it had to reckon with how completely he had already disappeared. Prince of Primetime, who faded. In the golden age of television, Richard Chamberlain reigned as a household name. His role as Dr. Kildare in the 1960s catapulted him into stardom, while later performances in The Thorn Birds and Shogun solidified his place as the unofficial king of the miniseries. For decades, his face was as familiar as the evening news, and his presence defined a generation of television. But as the years wore on, Chamberlain didn't cling to the spotlight. He quietly let it fade, retreating to the edges of fame like a ship slipping beyond the horizon. His final years were spent in Waimanalo, a quiet coastal town on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Far from the cameras, he lived a life of deliberate retreat. Neighbors knew of him, but rarely saw him. There were no lavish parties, no publicized birthdays, no final interviews reflecting on a life in showbiz. His passing, like his later life, was subdued and almost ghost-like, confirmed only through a single publicist's statement. The absence of ceremony was not a failure of memory, but a reflection of how deeply Chamberlain had chosen to recede. Unlike many of them who staged a comeback or published memoirs, Chamberlain never indulged in nostalgia. By personal design, his absence from that vicissitudinous Hollywood circuit was not in any way a loss of relevance, had remained, by and large, an admired figure long since. For him, it had long since become apparent that life as a legend has a heavy burden too great to carry forever. Even in his last interviews, he held only faint flashes of vulnerability, never quite letting the world in beyond the highly curated image. And even in death, as in life, Richard Chamberlain demonstrated that fame need not make a final bow. The man once adored by millions wanted no validation through headlines or through Hollywood retrospectives. He chose to fade into the rhythms of ocean waves and island winds, an icon not remembered with fanfare, but with stillness. His exit was not a fall from grace, but a quiet surrender to privacy, leaving the world to wonder how someone so beloved could vanish so completely. The ghost of a public icon. In his final years, Richard Chamberlain was more presence than person, his image etched permanently in pop culture, yet his physical self rarely seen. Locals in Waimanalo, Hawaii, described a quiet, thin man who strolled the beach in the early hours or just before dusk. Few spoke to him. Fewer still dared to ask about his past. To them, he was just Richard, the polite neighbor with a gentle smile and a distant gaze. The man who once commanded the screen with poise and charm had become something else entirely, a whisper. Despite his long reign as one of television's most recognizable faces, Chamberlain seemed to live in intentional obscurity. There were no grand portraits hanging in his home, no memorabilia from Dr. Kildare or Shogun, just scattered books, art supplies, and minimalist decor. Friends who visited in his later years noted how little he spoke of Hollywood. Fame, for Chamberlain, was something he had put on like a costume and long since taken off. In Hawaii, he was no longer an icon. He was a man shedding layers of a public life that had weighed too much, too long. Chamberlain was indeed many things to fans: the dignified doctor, the rugged adventurer, and the aristocratic hero. But to his own community, he existed as a shadow of personage. His neighbors did not take photographs or post sightings about him. They left him alone. It was an unacknowledged pact, a quiet gift he never asked for, but sorely needed. Fame had become an old relic, and with it, the boundaries within, who he was and who he was to be, began blurring until only the private man remained. The Richard Chamberlain, who once graced magazine covers and starred in beloved miniseries, was still very real to the world. But in Waimanalo, he had become an echo, not erased, just quietly edited out of public life. In a world obsessed with the visibility of fame, Chamberlain did the unthinkable. He walked away and stayed gone. By the time of his death, he was less a legend and more a silhouette, a ghost of Hollywood, living quietly by the sea. The love never spoken aloud. Martin Rabbit wasn't just Richard Chamberlain's partner. He was the only person who truly shared the actor's private life for more than 3 decades. Together since the early 1980s, the two were more than companions. They were collaborators, co-stars, and co-creators of a life that, by necessity, was lived quietly. They married in 1984, long before Chamberlain publicly came out as gay in 2003. In an era when such relationships were still taboo in Hollywood, their bond had to exist in the shadows. an intimacy protected but never publicly celebrated. Their separation in 2010, after nearly 30 years together, was described as amicable but rooted in conflicting paths. Chamberlain, then in his late 70s, refused to slow down his career. Rabet, according to reports, sought a quieter life. Chamberlain's relentless pursuit of work, his need to remain in motion, created a fissure that no affection could patch. Though they were no longer together at the time of Chamberlain's passing, Rabet's public tribute revealed how deep the connection still ran. "Love never dies," he wrote, a phrase both poetic and piercing in its finality. Rabet's status in the estate of Chamberlain, though a matter of controversy for historical purposes, still remains unknown. Rabet was expected by many to be a likely beneficiary, given that there were no children or present spouses. However, thus far, there has been no legal clarity. Were he to have been excluded from the will, questions emerge. Was it indeed separation for Chamberlain? Or, in trademark fashion, did he make arrangements that, as of now, remain hidden from view? Chamberlain kept such matters somehow cryptic while living. That silence throbs on in the aftermath. Most tragic is not what was spoken, but what was not. Chamberlain almost never publicly acknowledged Rabet or their life together, even after coming out. The strife of identity, imposed in an era prone to secrecy, bore down heavily. Even becoming famous didn't make that feeling go away, Chamberlain confessed in a 2014 interview. That agony of concealment has probably shaped Chamberlain's entire public persona, but it likely accounts for his private one as well. In the end, the love that most defined him may well be one that history has difficulty tracing. Unspoken, undocumented, but undebatably real. The wealth of a legend with no heirs. At the time of his death, Richard Chamberlain's net worth was estimated at $25 million, a lifetime of earnings from iconic television roles, film appearances, wage work, and real estate investments. Yet, unlike most celebrities of his stature, Chamberlain left behind no publicly known heirs. He had no children, and his long-term marriage to Martin Rabet had ended over a decade prior. With no clear successor and no spouse to legally claim the estate, his fortune became not a gift, but a riddle. The absence of direct heirs has left legal experts and former associates scrambling to determine the next steps. Normally, assets of this magnitude are protected and distributed through living trusts or detailed wills. But in Chamberlain's case, no such documents have yet been publicly confirmed. This has raised speculation about whether his famously private nature extended to his estate planning, or if, in typical Chamberlain fashion, the truth lies buried beneath layers of discretion and complexity. To make the case even stranger, Chamberlain had had a certain financial preeminence. Selling his house in Maui for slightly less than $14 million in 2011 almost seems to indicate that he was treating his portfolio almost strategically. If he had given any similar consideration to his will, the current uncertainty may not be incidental, but purposeful. Did he purposely create a situation to frustrate easy solutions to his legacy? Or could it be that fear of electing the wrong beneficiary, particularly after a life of emotional distance, caused him to select none at all? To a certain extent, the absence of an identified heir speaks to Chamberlain's own passage: lonely, interior, and very much in control. While his fans have a snapshot of this man contoured by the roles of eras, those closest to him are left with something far more complex, an inheritance malaise that is worth perhaps not a single dollar. What wealth, whoever files the papers these days with a memory of his doings, comes not in terms of numbers anymore, since it reflects a life lived in between public adulation and private isolation. It now lies suspended in legal promotion, waiting for a resolution that will perhaps never be fully satisfied. Just as the question of heirs deepens, a silent shift in real estate hints at a far more calculated farewell. The Maui estate and a vanishing trail. In 2011, Richard Chamberlain sold his sprawling estate on the island of Maui for $13.8 million, a move that passed quietly in the press but now stands out as a pivotal moment in the dismantling of his public identity. The sale marked more than just the end of a real estate chapter. It hinted at a shift in how Chamberlain wanted to be remembered, or perhaps forgotten. The Maui home, once a symbol of his success and retreat from Hollywood, was one of his most valuable known assets. Letting it go raised a question that still lingers. Was he preparing to fade? The timing of the sale aligns with a period in Chamberlain's life marked by increasing withdrawal. It came just a year after his separation from Martin Rabbit and well into his unofficial retirement from acting. While some interpreted the move as downsizing for peace or simplicity, others suspect it may have been part of a larger, calculated effort to sever ties with the financial entanglements of his public legacy. After all, a man so careful with his privacy might just as easily be careful with how his story and his assets were left behind. What happened next after the sale? Chamberlain moved to Waimanalo on Oahu, and very little is known about any new property purchases, trusts, or other financial transactions associated with proceeds from the sale. There has been no information on the donations made to the sale, nor any public documents that show what happened to the money. To this day, legal experts remain unsure whether they rolled the money into offshore accounts or simply placed it into anonymous foundations, or indeed, whether it was just hidden behind shell entities. The same goes for the man. The trail vanishes into silence. That huge amount of $13.8 million was once the notoriety of Chamberlain. Now it has become a dreaded ghost asset, not within range and possibly untraceable. If that Maui estate indeed was the jewel in the crown of his wealth, as related to the public, its disappearance from his portfolio could be the first step towards heralding Chamberlain's entry into the quiet exit plan. When we look back, the sale was further looked upon as symbolic of blocking the way back into him rather than simply a property sale. Whatever his plan during those last years, it was probably conceived right there on a bluff in Maui, where the Pacific waters stretch out in front of a legend that many would have liked to forget: unsent letters, unspoken regrets. Among the most personal discoveries made after Richard Chamberlain's death were letters, handwritten, unaddressed, and never mailed. Tucked away in drawers and boxes throughout his Waimanalo home, these pages bore raw reflections that had never been spoken aloud. Some were notes to Martin Rabbit, his former partner of over 30 years. Others were more abstract, apologies scrawled without a recipient, thoughts penned in the quiet hours when the cameras were long gone. These were not letters meant to be read. They were emotional confessions, released only onto paper. The content of the letters revealed a side of Chamberlain rarely seen in public, a man torn between his public persona and private longing. One note, reportedly dated shortly after his split with Rabbit, simply read, "I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to stay." Another contained reflections on his lifelong struggle with identity, lamenting that he had spent too many years performing off-screen. These were the words of a man who had mastered the art of presence, but had lived much of his life in absence, from himself, from others, and perhaps from the emotional truths he feared would cost him everything he had built. While Chamberlain came out publicly in 2003, these letters nevertheless showed that the fear of rejection never completely went away. In haunting passages he wrote, Seeing is not becoming known. That one quote sums up the entire essence of the tumult that tumbled within Chamberlain. Was able to go out and embrace millions, but never let the real him walk through the door behind characters. Those letters never sent, locked away in silence, are now the evidence of the emotional burden he bore privately. One not lightened by doting fans or the glimmer of stardom. These deeply personal documents will not be published in a glossy magazine tribute, nor will they be quoted at memorials. However, for anyone who finds such letters, perhaps a family member, perhaps a lawyer, or perhaps no one at all, these writings are the most authentic legacy he left behind. Not the estate, not the accolades, but the honest, unfiltered grief and gratitude of a man who spent his life walking the tightrope between image and intimacy. After his death, his silence was finally broken, though not with any headlines, but by the ink of his own quiet regrets. In a way, these unsent letters are a map, one that charts the winding roads of a man's emotional interior, where love and fear, hope and hesitation all collided in the margins. They speak not just to Chamberlain's personal journey, but to a broader human truth. That so many of us carry unsaid things, words we write only to the void. His handwriting, trembling in places, seemed to plead not for forgiveness, but simply for understanding. In the end, these pages may never be read aloud, but they whisper still, a final performance, not for the stage, but for the soul. The secret beneficiaries of a private will. As legal teams began combing through Richard Chamberlain's estate, a surprising pattern emerged. Several names listed in early will drafts and estate documents were unfamiliar, even to those closest to him. There were no children or direct heirs, and his former partner Martin Ravet's role remains unclear. But among the scattered beneficiaries were obscure figures: a retired theater colleague from his early stage days, a drama teacher from Pasadena, and a longtime gardener from the Waimanalo property. None were high-profile, none were expected, and yet each was carefully named, as if their place in his story had been deliberately preserved. These unlikely heirs weren't chosen for public symbolism or press appeal. They appeared to represent something far more intimate. Perhaps they were reminders of quiet kindnesses, of moments in Chamberlain's life when he felt seen not as a celebrity, but as a human being. One beneficiary, according to reports, was a former assistant who had retired in the 1980s, long before Chamberlain's final wave of fame. Another was linked to a small community theater where Chamberlain had once anonymously funded a youth production. These names, scattered across the will, painted a portrait of a man who remembered those who stood in the background long after the credits had rolled. For a public figure who held the most private aspects of his life so close, the omissions were perhaps more telling than the included names, a kind of redemption, as though flying into a quiet sea of connection in a life crossed by distance, emotional, romantic, and familial. Not the legacy network, but the memory network. There's something really deep about Chamberlain going beyond the bloodlines, beyond the headlines, towards silent witnesses to his journey. Piecing his fortune in a silent and less grandiose fashion, they knew him when he stood close enough to matter, even if the world never knew his name. Yet they raise questions as much as they shed light on the will. Why these people, and not those who walked with him on stage, screen, or spotlight? Are they gratitudes or quiet apologies? Chamberlain's estate will surely be measured in dollars, but its disbursement seems shaped by something more intangible than any time you breathe. Experience counts, pieces of trust, and a lasting desire to leave something more than fame behind. With his final act of benefaction, Richard Chamberlain chose not to reward the expected, but to celebrate the forgotten. In many ways, these quiet gifts feel like the closest thing to a memoir Chamberlain ever left behind, not written in chapters, but in choices. Each name etched into his will tells a story only he knew fully, suggesting that legacy, for him, wasn't about who stood in the limelight, but who stood by him and in silence. Some may have only shared a fleeting moment, a conversation, a kindness, a gesture that lingered. Others, perhaps, carried pieces of his truth when he couldn't carry it himself. Their inclusion reveals a man who, even in death, was trying to right invisible wrongs and acknowledge the ones who saw him, even when the world didn't. It's likely that many of these beneficiaries will never speak publicly, and perhaps that was exactly his intention. Chamberlain, who spent decades dodging invasive questions and deflecting personal scrutiny, seemed to design his will as a final act of protection for himself and for those he quietly loved. In the absence of public declarations, he left breadcrumbs of affection hidden in legal lines. And maybe, in the end, this quiet distribution was his version of closure, a legacy measured not in applause, but in presence. The Other Richard and His Hidden Legacy. Amid the fragmented records and quiet revelations following Richard Chamberlain's death, one whisper has begun to rise above the rest: the existence of a secret charitable fund known only by insiders as the Other Richard. Unconfirmed but widely speculated upon, the fund is rumored to mirror Gene Hackman's own clandestine GH Legacy Fund, and could be Chamberlain's final act of defiance against the spotlight that defined, but also confined, his life. If real, it represents more than a financial gesture. It reflects the version of Chamberlain few ever truly saw, the man behind the myth, the artist behind the mask. What little has surfaced suggests the fund, possibly created years before his passing, may be aimed at supporting LGBTQ youth and struggling artists, causes intimately connected to the battles Chamberlain faced in silence. After all, he spent the majority of his career concealing his sexuality, coming out publicly only in 2003. By then, he was long past his heartthrob prime, but still acutely aware of how many doors had once been closed to him, and how many dreams others like him never got the chance to pursue. The Other Richard, as an idea, seems like a poetic tribute to the version of himself he never got to be. All just from the name appears to denominate a duality on itself. On the one hand, we have a camera Richard, and on the other, a conscience-wielding one. While the Hollywood Richard graced magazine covers and played doctors and princes, the other lived yearning, privately shaped by eras, never making room for his truth. A secret fund, hidden away from headlines and devoid of vanity, would be totally in character. Chamberlain was never one for grand gestures. If he'd give, it'd be something he'd do silently. If he wished to heal, it would probably be through imperceptible threads. Up to now, there has been no official confirmation, and maybe there will never be. It is a fund that indeed exists, but only in dregs of paperwork, sealed envelopes, and encrypted files for a well-trusted confidant. But whether fact or urban legend, the Other Richard has become itself an icon of expiation, an icon of identity, an icon of the quiet rebellion of a man who lived between two selves. In the end, Richard Chamberlain is, perhaps, memorable for leaving behind things besides assets and accolades. He may have created an inheritance based not on reputation, but on the bravado of making premises of what he might have been instead, and allowing others to become who they are. As whispers of a secret legacy echo through his estate, another revelation waits. Quiet, unfinished, and far more personal. Final confession hidden in unfinished scripts. Tucked away in boxes labeled only by year, Richard Chamberlain's private archives contained more than memorabilia. They held fragments of an untold story. Among the scripts and handwritten notes discovered after his death were several pieces that blurred the line between fiction and memoir. Some were screenplays, others were personal essays, never submitted for publication. One document, barely begun, opened with a line that stopped the breath of those who read it. "If I were born again, I'd ask for no talent, no fame, just the courage to love openly." It was a chilling confession from a man who had spent his life performing, not just on screen, but in the eyes of the world. These unfinished works offered a portrait of Chamberlain far removed from the suave characters he portrayed. There were passages reflecting on his decision to stay closeted during the peak of his fame, and imagined scenes of conversations he never had. With fans, with Martin Rabbit, with himself. One piece followed a character loosely based on his own life, navigating the glitter of Hollywood while quietly unraveling behind closed doors. Though no names were ever mentioned, the emotional truth was unmistakable. The pages read not like scripts, but like confessions. A man finally peeling off layers of image to reveal the ache underneath. Not one of these pieces had closure, none are finished, and none bear the marks of a publisher's eye. They seem written for the drawer, or as a private act of exorcism. Without public memoirs or tell-all interviews, these may come closest to Chamberlain's unbuffered truth. He never took a final leave of the world, but in these work-in-progress things, he left behind something deeper. A reckoning about everything he was given by fame and everything it quietly stole from him. These works may or may not be published someday, but they are the keys to turning on the real Richard Chamberlain. A dual-burdened man who would have had one side of his life lived in love and the other side in fear and under pressure from society's expectations. In the end, perhaps his most haunting legacy will not be the one cast in the spotlight he once commanded, but in the shadows from which he wrote. Through these pages and those forgotten, we see the man not as a heartthrob or icon, but still searching for meaning, for peace, and for the kind of love that does not have to hide behind a script. Among the most powerful of these fragments were those that questioned legacy itself. One handwritten page mused, "What if the thing I'm remembered for is the mask, not the man?" In those quiet reflections, Chamberlain wrestled not with fame, but with erasure, of identity, of love, of the self that never got to speak freely. These weren't cries for recognition, they were whispers of longing, as if the very act of writing was his way of reclaiming a voice he had long silenced to survive. Line by line, he seemed to peel back the carefully constructed persona to confront what had been lost in its making. Some drafts ended mid-sentence, abruptly cut, as if emotion had overtaken him, or the truth had become too difficult to finish. A few were scribbled in margins, others in notebooks stained with age. Together, they form a kind of emotional breadcrumb trail, a story not told chronologically, but in flickers of honesty. Whether they are ever read by the public or remain buried in boxes, these pages mark a final, quiet rebellion. A man who once feared being fully seen may have, in these writings, finally let himself be known. If this story left you thinking, questioning, or feeling something you didn't expect, don't let it end here. Go ahead and hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts or memories of Richard Chamberlain, And subscribe for more deep dives into the lives behind the legends. And if you're still curious about what Chamberlain may have left behind, emotionally or otherwise, watch the next video now. It might just reveal the part of his story that was never meant to be seen.